Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
My mom said the reunion was for those who've actually achieved something. I wasn't invited. Funny thing is, I was the one keeping their lights on, quietly, behind the scenes. So I pulled the plug, literally, and now their whole world is going up in flames. They just don't know I'm the one who lit the match. It wasn't that I expected some parade or spotlight. I've long accepted that in my family, being noticed only ever meant being compared, and being compared usually meant being quietly dissected and put back together in a version they could tolerate. I'm 38 now. I've spent most of my adult life outside the glow of their pride, and after a while, you learn to live in the shadows with a quiet dignity, or at least you tell yourself that. But this hit different. It was my cousin Renee who told me, completely by accident, about the reunion. She texted me a week before, asking what dress I was wearing, and when I responded with a confused "what reunion?" she immediately backpedaled with that classic, "Oh my God, I thought for sure you were going. I just assumed." That assumption stung more than I cared to admit, because in her eyes, I should have been there. In her eyes, I belonged. But apparently, in my mother's eyes, I didn't. A day later, when I finally worked up the nerve to call her, she sounded busy, disinterested, and half annoyed to even be answering. When I mentioned Renee's message, there was a pause, just long enough to make my chest tighten. Then she said, "Well, sweetheart, it's mostly for those in the family who've, made something of themselves. It's not personal." And that was it. No apology, no awkward excuse. Just a smooth dismissal, the kind you deliver after rehearsing it in the mirror, until it feels like truth. And let me be clear, it's not like I'm unemployed or living in someone's basement playing video games all day. I work in mid-market finance, managing portfolios and advising mid-sized businesses, mostly family-run ones. Irony noted. I pay my own bills. I have a condo. I'm not flashy, but I'm stable. I've made something of myself. But in the eyes of my parents, especially my mother, success has a dress code and a list of approved occupations, and somehow, quietly thriving outside the limelight just doesn't qualify. But what burned me the most wasn't just the fact that I wasn't invited, it was the way she said it, like being excluded was a matter of logistics, a rational decision based on merit, as if a mother tallying her child's achievements on a scoreboard and finding them insufficient was just good sense. I sat there after the call, phone in hand, staring at the wall like it might offer some kind of answer. But all it gave me was the reflection of someone who'd spent years pouring into a family that always looked the other way. Here's something my mother doesn't know. 2 years ago, my dad came to me in private. His small construction supply business, the one he'd sunk his entire retirement into, was floundering. Not enough clients, bad contracts, and an over-leveraged expansion that left them bleeding cash. He didn't tell my mom, because pride is a fragile thing in that house, especially his. He came to me with a mix of shame and hope, and I, being the daughter who never quite measured up, said yes without hesitation. I wired in $200,000 over 6 months, disguised as a silent investment. No ownership stake. Just a handshake and a promise to stay in the background. I even helped him restructure his books, connected him with a more reasonable lender, and taught his office manager how to track receivables like an actual business. Slowly, things started to stabilize, but none of that counted in my mother's ledger because it didn't come with a title or a bragging point. So sitting there, humiliated by her words, I started thinking, not emotionally, not at first, but practically. I wasn't angry in the way most people get angry. I didn't throw things or scream into a pillow. I got quiet, focused. I started running numbers in my head like I would for a client I didn't like very much. I thought about what my money was doing in that business, how it was propping up a dream that had been mismanaged for years, and how, without it, everything might just unravel. And then, for the first time in my life, I thought, what if I let it? Now, I know how that sounds, petty, vindictive, like I wanted them to fail out of spite, But that's not it. At least not entirely. It was more like a shift in balance. I had spent so many years asking for recognition in subtle ways, hoping my small contributions might eventually add up to something worthy of a seat at their table. But maybe I didn't need their table. Maybe they needed mine. They just hadn't realized it yet. So I started sketching a plan, not some evil genius sabotage, not anything criminal or cruel. Just a slow withdrawal, a reversal of support. I'd be as silent pulling out as I was going in, because if they thought I wasn't worth a damn, then they shouldn't miss me when I'm gone, right? And here's where I want to ask you, if you were in my shoes, knowing your own parents saw you as less than, would you do it? Would you pull your support and let the chips fall where they may? Or would you keep holding them up, hoping they'd one day look down and realize who was carrying the weight? Because I didn't slam any doors that night. I didn't send any dramatic texts or write some self-righteous email. I just went to bed, stared at the ceiling, and decided that starting tomorrow, I'd begin reclaiming what was mine. Not out of revenge, but out of clarity. The family reunion came and went. I saw pictures later, posted by cousins I barely speak to, smiling in button-downs and sundresses under white tents, holding champagne flutes and posing for photos with that polished, curated joy my mother always loved. I wasn't there, but I was done pretending I wanted to be. They wanted achievers. They'd get achievers, but not the way they expected. Not with trophies or applause, with silence, with absence, and eventually with collapse. When people talk about revenge, they usually picture something loud, screaming matches, dramatic exits, social media exposes, or slamming car doors while the other person stands dumbfounded in the driveway. But real revenge, the kind that sinks deep and leaves marks that don't heal, with a Band-Aid apology, is often quiet, calculated, and unfolds over time like a storm that was building while everyone else was busy checking the forecast for sunshine. And the truth is, I didn't even set out for revenge at first. That wasn't my plan. I didn't wake up the next morning thinking, I'm going to ruin them. No, what I woke up with was a kind of eerie calm, the kind that settles in when you stop begging for love and start counting the ways they've underestimated you. That's where it really started. For the better part of the last 2 years, I had been the invisible backbone of my father's company, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't mind staying in the shadows as long as things were moving in the right direction. I had my own job, a demanding one at that, and didn't have the time or the energy to be managing someone else's dream full-time, but I cared. Not just about the money. I had more secure investments that made better returns, but this was family, or at least that's what I kept telling myself, even when it felt more like I was bailing water out of a boat with holes I didn't put there. It started innocently, like most obligations we say yes to, before realizing we've chained ourselves to something that will eventually sink us. Dad had come to me during one of our rare father-daughter breakfasts, where we both pretended it was just casual catching up. But underneath it all, I could see the tension pulling at the corners of his smile. His hands, once steady and strong, were fidgeting with his coffee cup, and the moment he started saying things like, just until the next contract lands, and temporary cash flow hiccup, I knew what was coming. He wasn't just there for eggs and toast. He needed a lifeline. And even though I should have asked more questions, even though I should have looked at the books more closely before agreeing, I didn't. I trusted him. Or maybe I just wanted for once to be useful in a way that he and Mom couldn't deny. I wired $50,000 that week with no paperwork, no formal agreement, just a promise and a handshake over a Formica table in a diner that smelled like burnt bacon and fading dreams. Over the next year and a half, that amount climbed to nearly $200,000. I kept convincing myself it was temporary, that they'd pay it back when the business stabilized, but that stabilization never really came. It just kept wobbling forward, barely balanced by my injections of cash and advice. What I didn't expect, what really stung later, was that no one else in the family knew. Or if they did, they didn't talk about it. Mom never acknowledged it, not once. When she called me to update me on Eric's latest court victory or how Aunt Joanne's daughter had been accepted into Yale, she never once mentioned the fact that I was the reason the lights in Dad's office still turned on every morning. I started to realize that to her, helping silently didn't count. Success was only success if it could be displayed, dressed up, and paraded in front of others with champagne and applause. And since I never asked for any of that, they pretended I hadn't done anything at all. So when she said the reunion was for those who've actually achieved something, it landed not like a knife, but like a switch flipping. I looked at the numbers again the next morning. Dad's monthly burn rate, his contract pipeline, the loan terms I had negotiated to buy him some breathing room. It was all laid out like a chessboard, and suddenly I saw something I hadn't let myself see before. I wasn't just helping, I was enabling. I was keeping a leaky boat afloat for a man too proud to admit he needed more than just a financial patch. And in doing so, I was keeping my mother comfortable in the delusion that their world was built on their own merit. Maybe it was time to see what happened when the crutch got pulled away. I didn't pull the plug immediately. That would have been too obvious, too chaotic. No, I started gradually, like a tide slipping out to sea before anyone notices the sand is drying. I spoke to a financial advisor I trusted and began restructuring my other investments to quietly prepare for the extraction. I stopped responding to his emails with urgency. When he called, I'd let it ring a little longer before picking up. I eased off the bookkeeping oversight, stopped offering suggestions, and most importantly, I told him, softly, respectfully, that I'd need to start pulling some funds back over the next 6 months due to changes in my personal portfolio. I framed it like it had nothing to do with them, just basic financial planning. He thanked me, didn't argue, didn't ask for more time. Maybe part of him suspected something, or maybe he was just relieved I wasn't cutting him off entirely, yet. The funny thing is, once I started distancing myself, I began to see it all for what it was. The office was still a mess. The contracts he counted on kept falling through. The employee turnover was higher than ever. My money had been buying time, not building anything real. Without me, it was just a house of cards waiting for the wrong breeze. And while I wasn't ready to blow on it just yet, I was definitely done standing in the wind trying to hold it up. There's a kind of freedom that comes with no longer needing to be seen. For so long I had waited for their approval like a kid standing at the edge of a diving board, hoping someone would look up and say, "That's my girl." But they never did. They were too busy watching Eric, too invested in their curated image of what success looked like. So I stopped waiting. I started planning. Because if they wanted success, I'd show them what it looked like. Not the kind that smiles for pictures under a reunion tent, but the kind that builds itself from scratch, quietly, and knows exactly when to walk away. There's something deeply unsettling about watching something collapse from the inside out, especially when you know exactly which support beams you're removing and in what order, and even more so when you're doing it not with anger or vengeance pumping through your veins, but with a sort of cold, clinical resolve that feels more like an audit than an act of rebellion. In the weeks following that phone call with my mother, the one where she so casually dismissed my existence from the family narrative, I began pulling myself out of my father's business with the precision of a surgeon removing a failing organ, careful not to kill the body immediately, but fully aware that without the function it provided, the decline was inevitable. By that point, I knew every weak spot, every inflated number on a balance sheet, every vendor hanging by a thread waiting for a delayed payment, and every employee quietly dusting off their resume behind closed doors. I had seen the operation from both sides. The hopeful intentions of a man who once dreamed big, but got swallowed by poor timing, worse decisions, and a complete inability to admit when he was in over his head. And the stark reality of a business held together by little more than loyalty and denial. And I had been the thread between them, the invisible hand keeping the plates spinning while everyone else clapped for the show, not realizing how close everything was to crashing. The first thing I did was stop supplementing payroll. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't bounce a check or leave anyone unpaid, but I stopped covering the shortfalls when accounts receivable didn't come in fast enough. I had been quietly adding funds at the end of bad months just to ensure everyone got their direct deposit. And I realized that by doing that, I had created a false sense of stability. So I let the first wave hit. When the office manager called me in a panic because the funds in the payroll account didn't line up with the scheduled distributions, I calmly told her I was no longer in a position to float the difference. I could hear the hesitation in her voice, that awkward blend of confusion and fear that comes when someone realizes the safety net beneath them wasn't theirs to begin with. I didn't call my dad. I didn't offer explanations. I let the tension build naturally, like a storm gathering just past the horizon while the sun is still shining, because I wanted him to feel it, not out of spite, but because he needed to stop believing the business was floating on merit alone. He had stopped checking the numbers months ago, comfortable in the illusion that everything was fine. He didn't notice that I had gradually begun withdrawing my informal financial support, moving automatic transfers into separate accounts, rerouting vendor payments back to him, and disengaging from his bi-weekly phone calls with increasingly vague responses. And slowly the business began to wobble in ways it hadn't in over a year. Orders were delayed. One of the subcontractors backed out of a major project citing delayed payments. The landlord, who had been patient up until now, issued a formal warning about the overdue lease. And all the while, my father kept trying to troubleshoot symptoms instead of identifying the root. He called me a few times during that stretch, his tone still oddly upbeat, asking if I had time to look over a new bid proposal or review a contract he was considering, but I kept it distant. I said things like, "I'm swamped with client work," or "maybe you should run it past an attorney," knowing full well he didn't have one on retainer anymore because I had been handling all the quick legal reviews myself for over a year. I think the moment he realized something was wrong was during a family dinner at Renee's house. The first one I attended since the reunion debacle, mostly out of a sense of curiosity rather than reconciliation. Dad was there, quieter than usual, fiddling with the edge of his napkin and staring off mid-conversation. At one point, he leaned toward me, voice low, and said, Is everything okay with your investments?" I nodded without flinching and replied, "Yes, I'm doing fine, just reassessing some priorities." He didn't push, and I didn't offer more, and in that silence between us sat a weight he hadn't fully grasped yet. Meanwhile, my mother remained blissfully unaware, or at least pretended to be. She chatted at the table about someone's new vacation home, about Eric's recent mention in some regional law review, about how proud she was of how far the family had come. I watched her the way you watch someone talk in their sleep, detached, almost amused, and vaguely embarrassed for them. She had spent so many years building a version of our family she could show off that she had no clue how rotten the foundation was becoming. The real turning point came when I pulled the final cord, the one that mattered most. That loan I had structured with a private lender for Dad's company was set to come up for renewal. I had personally vouched for it, using part of my own portfolio to secure better terms. All I had to do was sign the extension agreement and allow the loan to roll over with minimal disruption. Instead, I let the deadline pass. Quietly, no phone call, no warning, I just didn't sign. 3 days later, I got an email from the lender stating that without my personal guarantee, they were unwilling to renew the loan under the same conditions and would be initiating collection on the remaining balance unless a new agreement was reached. That was when my phone finally rang. Not a casual call, but a real one. My father's name flashed on the screen, and I let it ring 4 times before answering. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the strain underneath. "I got a notice from the lender. Says they're not renewing. Did you decide not to sign?" he asked. And when I said yes, just a simple, measured yes, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Why?" And for the first time, I told the truth without filtering it to protect his feelings. Because I've been subsidizing this business for 2 years, and I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being the one behind the curtain while Mom talks about achievers like I don't exist. If you want to run the company, you need to own all of it, including the risk. I can't keep carrying it for you. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just said, "Okay," in a voice so small I almost didn't recognize it. And then he hung up. That was the moment the plug was fully out of the wall. No more silent lifelines, no more invisible contributions. It was all on him now, and I knew, without a doubt, that the unraveling had just begun. There's a strange, almost surreal kind of stillness that comes right before a downfall, the kind that lingers in the air like humidity before a violent thunderstorm, where everyone pretends things are fine simply because the wind hasn't yet picked up, the skies haven't yet turned black, and no one's willing to look up long enough to admit they can feel it coming. That was exactly the energy radiating from my father's business in the final weeks after I pulled my support. And while I knew I wasn't technically holding the smoking gun, I also knew I'd quietly removed every bulletproof vest they had left without so much as a warning shot. And even though I kept telling myself I was done, that I had already walked away, some small buried part of me still clung to the fantasy that maybe, just maybe, my absence would make them see clearly what my presence never could. But that kind of clarity never came. What came instead was the slow, grinding collapse of a system that had been patched together with denial, duct tape, and the kind of blind optimism that only thrives when someone else is footing the bill. At first, it was subtle. Vendors started calling more frequently, not angry, not even frustrated, just weary. You could hear it in their voices, that tone people use when they've been burned before but are still trying to give you the benefit of the doubt, even if they already know how the story ends. Payments were late, small ones at first, then larger, and with no safety net in place, my father was forced to juggle due dates like a man playing a game he was no longer young enough to win. His secretary quit suddenly, claiming personal reasons, but I knew from a friend of a friend that she had taken a higher-paying job elsewhere after watching too many checks bounce and too many promises dissolve into apologies. Clients began walking away from pending contracts, citing delays and poor communication, and word started to spread quietly through the local contractor grapevine that the once reliable supply company was now a liability. One missed shipment turned into two. One angry email from a general contractor became three more behind it. By the time the first negative review hit Google, it was too late to reverse the narrative. And anyone who's worked in small-town business knows that once your reputation starts to slide, trying to stop it feels like catching a refrigerator with your bare hands. And in the middle of all this chaos, my mother, ever oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind, remained fixed in her pristine version of reality, still hosting brunches with neighbors and posting curated photos of garden parties and wine tastings, smiling like nothing beneath their polished exterior had started to rot. She never mentioned the trouble at Dad's company, never brought up the mounting debt or the credit line that was now in collection, and certainly never once asked me to step in, not directly at least. But I could see it in her eyes the one time she visited me, by coincidence, dropping by my condo unannounced with a Tupperware full of lemon bars and 1,000 unspoken questions swirling behind her carefully composed expression. She looked around my place with the kind of distant approval a museum visitor gives to an exhibit they can't quite understand but feel obligated to admire. Then she sat down on my couch, folded her hands in her lap, and asked, in the most casually rehearsed tone she could muster, "How's work going for you these days?" It was a baited hook, and we both knew it. I answered with practiced ease, telling her business was fine, that I was busy, that things were steady, and then I said nothing more. I didn't ask about Dad's company. I didn't offer an opening for her to bring it up. I let the silence do the heavy lifting, and eventually she gave up, pretending she had only stopped by, because she happened to be in the neighborhood. But I knew better. I knew that under all the polished smiles and polite conversation, their world was unraveling strand by strand, and she had come looking for a life raft without the humility to ask for it outright. The final nail came 3 weeks later in the form of a formal letter, delivered via certified mail, to my father's office, notifying him that due to breach of loan terms and missed repayments, the lender would be initiating legal proceedings to recover the outstanding balance. When he called me that evening, I almost didn't pick up, but some part of me, the small piece of the daughter I used to be, still answered, still hoping, maybe foolishly, that this time the conversation would be different. But it wasn't. His voice trembled, not with anger, but with something worse, desperation. He asked if there was anything I could do, any way I could help restructure the loan, maybe just temporarily vouch again. Just for a little while, just to buy him more time. And when I said no, when I explained, gently, firmly, that I couldn't keep pouring money into a business that refused to adapt or take responsibility, the silence that followed was so heavy I thought the line had gone dead. Finally, he said, "But I thought we were a team." And those words, delivered with such honest pain, cut deeper than I expected. I didn't respond right away because how do you explain to someone that the team ended the moment they stopped treating you like part of it? How do you say, "I was never on the field, I was in the stands, paying for the lights so the game could go on"? Eventually I told him, I tried longer and harder than I should have. But I can't save something that won't even admit it's broken. He didn't argue, he just sighed, the kind of sigh that sounds like someone aging 10 years in one breath. And then said, "Okay, I understand," even though I knew he didn't. By the end of that month, the office closed, the website went offline, the phone number was disconnected, and just like that, the business was gone, leaving behind only debt, questions, and the lingering silence of a family that had been pretending for years that everything was fine. And the thing that haunted me most wasn't the fallout or the bankruptcy filings or the people who lost jobs. It was the emptiness I felt when it was all over, the hollow ache of having won a war I never wanted to fight. I had pulled the plug, and the machine had shut down exactly as I knew it would. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was a slow-burning grief for everything that could have been different if only they had seen me. Not as a backup plan, not as a silent investor or a fixer in the shadows, but as a daughter who, for once, deserved to be seen. In the weeks that followed the official closure of my father's company, a kind of eerie stillness settled over everything. Not the peaceful kind that comes after resolution, but the heavy, weighted silence that lingers after something has broken so completely that even the echoes of it feel too fragile to speak aloud. I wasn't surprised that no one called to talk about it directly. My family has never been the type to discuss discomfort head-on, and if anyone felt inclined to ask questions, they buried those urges under politeness, small talk, or the kind of vague, meandering conversations that wrap themselves in casual tones, while carefully avoiding the jagged truth sitting between every word. And as much as I thought I'd feel triumphant when it all came crashing down, as much as I'd pictured that final scene of justice, where they'd look around at the wreckage and finally see who'd been holding it all up, what I actually felt was something else entirely, something harder to name and even harder to sit with. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, and it certainly wasn't regret in the traditional sense. I didn't second-guess the decisions I had made, nor did I believe for one moment that things could have gone differently if I had simply thrown in one more check, one more favor, one more sleepless night, fixing messes that were never mine to begin with. But what did begin to gnaw at me was the emptiness that followed the fall, that strange absence of satisfaction, when the people who hurt you never acknowledge that they did, when the apology you deserve never comes, and instead you're left with a void where accountability should be, a hollow space where justice should live but never quite moves in. Word got around quickly, of course. Bad news has a way of traveling faster than truth, and in small communities, the fall of a family business doesn't just end with a closed door and a for sale sign. It ripples outward like a stone thrown into a shallow pond. Old clients stopped by to ask what happened, pretending to be concerned while subtly probing for gossip. Extended relatives sent vague texts asking if I'd heard the news, as if I wasn't the one who knew the ending before the story even started. And my cousin Renee, always more in tune than she let on, showed up on my doorstep one evening with a bottle of wine and a look that said she knew, or at least suspected, far more than she was letting on. She didn't press me for details, which I appreciated, but halfway through the second glass, she leaned back, looked at me across the table, and said quietly, "You know, they're telling people it was the economy, right? that it just wasn't sustainable anymore. No one's mentioning you. And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so exactly what I expected, so perfectly on brand for a family that had built its entire identity on public image and denial. Of course I wasn't mentioned. Of course the story was being rewritten in real time, to preserve the illusion of control, of nobility, of tragic circumstances beyond anyone's grasp. It was easier for them to blame a vague financial climate than to admit they had leaned on someone they dismissed, someone they undervalued, and that when she finally stepped away, the whole damn thing fell apart. But Renee, to her credit, didn't try to soften the blow. She just nodded, then asked the question that had been circling in my own head for days, though I hadn't dared say it aloud. Do you think you went too far? And I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have one, but because the answer was messy, tangled, full of contradictions that didn't fit neatly into the lines of good and bad, right and wrong. I thought about my father's voice on the phone, small and tired and unsure. I thought about my mother's eyes that day in my condo, scanning for a door she didn't have the words or the humility to knock on. And I thought about myself, standing there in the middle of a life I had built on my own, still waiting deep down for someone to finally say they were proud of me. No, I said finally, setting my glass down with a quiet thud. I don't think I went too far. I think I went far enough. And I believed it. But even believing it didn't make it easy. Because the truth is, winning doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like loss in a different outfit, one that fits better but still chafes in all the old places. I hadn't destroyed my family, not really. I had just removed myself from a lie they refused to stop telling, and in doing so, I revealed the truth they weren't ready to face. The days stretched into weeks, and eventually the phone calls stopped altogether. My father didn't try again, and my mother, true to form, resumed her rotation of curated social media posts and carefully filtered updates, painting a picture of resilience that had nothing to do with reality. Eric, who had always operated in his own orbit, sent me a generic holiday text 3 months later. No mention of the business, no questions about how I was doing, just a 3-line message with a snowflake emoji and a hope you're well. And I suppose in a way, that was the final confirmation I needed. They weren't going to change, and I wasn't going to wait anymore. I began to invest more time in the things that actually brought me peace. My work, my friendships, my own home that I didn't have to shrink in. I traveled more, took weekends off without guilt, learned how to cook dishes I used to order out of habit, and little by little, the ache dulled, the resentment quieted, replaced not by forgiveness, but by a kind of peaceful detachment. I didn't need them to admit anything. I didn't need an apology to validate the truth I already knew. I had pulled my weight for too long in a system that refused to see me, and now, on the other side of it all, I had finally chosen myself. Still, there are nights when the silence creeps in heavier than usual, when a memory slides in uninvited, or a family photo catches me off guard in an old album buried under things I meant to throw out. And during those moments, I sometimes wonder if I was too hard, too cold, too calculated. I wonder if there might have been another way, a softer path, a different version of the story where we all came out a little less bruised. But then I remember that they chose the rules long before I ever learned how to play the game. They taught me what value looked like. They showed me what it meant to be invisible in plain sight. And in the end, I simply held up the mirror and let them look for themselves. I never got invited to another reunion. I don't expect I ever will. But if you ask me now whether I'd do it all the same, knowing what it would cost, knowing what it would break, I wouldn't hesitate. Because some things don't need fixing, some things need to fall, and I didn't push. I just stopped holding it up.